So last time we were discussing the difficulty with isoglosses, why it's, even though in theory it's a nice idea, again, there's a lot of decisions that come into drawing a dialect boundary and deciding what belongs to dialect A and what belongs to dialect B. So quite often, isogloss lines do not give us a clear picture. This is especially the case for phonological features that are so susceptible to variation and change. The ideal are the isoglosses that coincide. That's the ideal situation, that they're unproblematic. But in reality, isoglosses are variable and they may crisscross. And different features may have different patterns. Using the traditional dialect geography model of the family tree that dialectology traditionally did to trace back the origins of languages and dialects could not work for this scenario. It's simply just too neat. So isoglosses do cross, and bundles of them are actually rare, so that they coincide a lot in a bundle, like the expectation in figure A, is quite rare. But there are a lot of issues besides the fact that modeling isoglosses is rare and it's difficult. I mean, it happens, but it's a difficult decision. Specifically, the issues that arose in traditional dialectology had to do with the issue of population sampling. So, So, again, a lot of these traditional conservative studies of dialectology were interested in the conservative speaker and the easily definable person that lived in the most remote region, untouched from linguistic innovation and mobility. So historically, traditional dialectology favored people from rural regions who were regarded as linguistically conservative and therefore representative as preserving older forms. Urban areas were acknowledged as innovative, unstable linguistically, and difficult to approach with existing survey techniques. When urban areas were approached, conservative speakers were sought out. So again, there was a preference for the rural over the urban. And if the urban was considered, then it had to be the most stable speaker that could be deemed as representative. And there was circularity in how social class was addressed. So that's a second setback. And this had to do with the fact that a lot of traditional dialectology studies and atlases were made in order to understand how language was spread across region and class, so social class. But then the same way that class was a question, class was also a feature or a description that they used to define the informant. So for instance, if you were working class, it was because you belonged to that class and you also had to speak like a working class member. So speech itself was used as one of the criteria for assigning membership in social class. So it was a bit circular because you were asking the question of what do they speak, those classes, but then you're kind of answering yourself already by making these assumptions. So in 1939, there was an atlas published by Cura, the Linguistic Atlas of the United States and Canada. So the Linguistic Atlas of the United States and Canada gathered informants on the basis of the following criteria. Type 1, little formal education, little reading, and restricted social contacts. So somebody that was super homogeneous. Type 2, better formal education, whatever that means. Sorry, usually high school, and or wider reading and social contacts. Type 3, superior education, usually college, cultured background, wide reading and or extensive social contacts. So a third methodological issue for traditional dialectology was that there was one field worker, one sole worker who made all of the categorization choices. So the one field worker decided exactly where each informant or each participant fit in their categories. So they're the ones that ascribed to others labels. The field worker alone judged whether a particular informant fitted in the descriptions or categorizations. So some more fine-grained subcategories of informants of this atlas. Type A, aged and or regarded by field worker as old-fashioned. Type B, middle-aged or young and or regarded by field worker as more modern, whatever that means. So in England, there was also an atlas conducted in the 1950s and 1961 that had similar types of practices that focused on a particular speaker at the expense of diversity and other speakers. So in the English atlas, there was a bias for male informants. So there were informants from 313 localities in England and Wales, and they employed similar conservative criteria in gathering these informants. So they sought out elderly men and women, and more often men. They were to be over 60 years of age with good mouths, teeth, and hearing. Typically, both informants and field workers were male, as females were marginalized by dialectologists. So there was a gender bias. Women encouraged in the family the social upgrading of everybody collectively through speech. So the social upgrading of the speech of the families. So moving to standard and innovative varieties. So they tended to speak a little bit more politely or conservatively, or sorry, not conservatively, or try to mimic or emulate whatever was socially mobile. But they ignored women in those studies. Number five for traditional dialectology is that there was bias for one type of variant as well, one type of linguistic feature. And an informant couldn't speak variably. So if you produce something one way, you always produced it that same way. If you knew one word for an item, you would always know that word and use that word for that item. So if you said soda, for instance, you couldn't say pop. So individual speakers do not have variation in their speech in traditional dialectology. This is called the axiom of categoricity. So it treats linguistic variables as if they are categorical, so fixed in speech of an individual. So an individual will speak bilingually, yes, no, and nobody cares to what extent and when and if always, just yes or no in the binary. And this kind of assumption is just as bad as what we saw previously of the ideal speech community or the ideal speaker listener and all these conservative constructs that lead us nowhere because they're not realistic. Setback number 6 is the reduction of defining a speaker on the basis of where they come from, region. So there was a bias towards geographic origin, where other factors are at work. So people just assume that according to where you live, that's how you're gonna speak. But we know, previous chapters have taught us that actually no, there are a lot of fluid constructs and other constructs that can help us determine how someone speaks, like social and cultural background, age, sex, gender identity, race, occupation, and group loyalty. Number 7, there was a focus on stability and isolation. So that means that speakers were taken as not interacting with people from other regions or other contexts. So they were a direct depiction of their homogeneous and isolated community. So dialect boundaries can only be said to be regular, however, if you are prepared to categorize certain kinds of irregularities, relics, borrowings, and minor variations, and so on. So in order for you to draw boundaries of dialects, you have to be able to weed out innovation and weed out variation. For instance, borrowings, are they a part of the dialect? No, they're not. Or irregularities, you ignore them, right? In favor of the clearer, regular picture. So again, focus on stability. So it's traditional dialectology has a long history, and it has certain characteristics that define it as different from modern dialectology. Perhaps one of the biggest advancements that modern dialectology brought with the work of William LaBeouf was that while before people focused on the rural areas and the conservative speaker, with William LaBeouf in the 70s and in the 80s, he really focused on urban and inner city regions where all the linguistic innovation was happening. And he paid attention to the speech of ethnic minorities and all these people that had been traditionally overlooked. So he was really a pioneer in that, in terms of the informant, what the informant looked like, as well as he was also a methodological pioneer because he came up with a set of techniques that would help elicit different variation in a speaker. So that was another thing, that's another thing that modern dialectology has that's different from traditional, that modern dialectology acknowledges that a person won't always sound the same, but that there's intra-speaker variation. And also, of course, the advancements of software and computing have allowed modern dialectologists and sociolinguists to gather and conduct all sorts of data, big data, large data sets, and a lot of accurate statistical methods, multivariate methods out there for observing speech distribution. And there is a less restricted focus, so study of diverse social groups, so age, class, male, female, different ethnic groups, and so on. Right now, we're even looking at identity, social identity, as well as the role of the meaning in a particular linguistic feature and whether that could determine its distribution. So modern linguists acknowledge intra-speaker variation. There are two terms that maybe you should know. So one of them is dialect mixture. So dialect mixture refers to the existence in one locality of two or more dialects which allow a speaker to or hearer to draw on one dialect and then the other. An alternative explanation of people speaking variably and using different dialectal features is free variation. So variation of no social significance. But that seems a little bit radical to arrive at that conclusion. And in order for you to even assess that something is freely variable, you'll have to like exhaust all of the different methods and ways of analyzing linguistic data, because close analysis reveals that complex linguistic and social factors often explain much of the variation. And there are a lot of cool new or modern linguistic atlases and dialectology studies right now. So for instance, in 1996, there was a linguistic atlas of Middle and South Atlantic states. LAMSAS used a lot of qualitative methods to demonstrate the probability of occurrence of specific words and sounds in certain areas. And of course, we have the work by William LaBeouf and others, the Atlas of North American English, ANAE, which I gave you guys a copy of one of the chapters on lexical variation so you could read on your own. So this is also another large-scale quantitative study in the cities of the US whose populations are over 50,000. So work shows that there is regional dialects that regional dialects are getting stronger actually, despite increased mobility, and more diverse as language change is continuing. So language change continues and structural divisions between them are very sharp, very tight bundling of the isoglosses, according to Labov. And of course, there's also work in other parts of the world on dialectology. So we mentioned England, and now there's an example from Denmark of a study that was conducted for many years, as you can see, from 1890 to 1996. And that dialectal study uses information from economic, demographic, and social data from 3,797 informants or residents of a specific region in Denmark. So that's quite impressive in terms of its length. And modern variationist studies in dialectology pay attention to a host of different experimental factors and experimental themes that traditional dialectologists didn't do. So for instance, modern variation pays attention to stating a hypothesis or hypothesis testing. They pay attention to how sampling is conducted, whether sampling is representative, how many numbers should we have for each linguistic category, for each research question. The statistical treatment of data right now is very meticulous. It's very good. It's very advanced. And the drawing of conclusions as well has changed. So before, whereas the drawing of a conclusion was merely to draw maps of how people spoke in different areas, now they relate conclusions of variation to the inherent nature of language or how language works, the inherent nature of language acquisition, how people acquire sociolinguistic features and language change, as well as now people draw conclusions on the social functions and the social meanings of particular language forms, and you can arrive at an accurate conclusion based on these statistical trends. So modern variationist studies are concerned with the idea of the linguistic variable. And the linguistic variable is a linguistic item with identifiable variants or variations. So identifiable different ways of saying the same thing, basically. So the same thing is a linguistic variable, and the different ways of saying it are the variants. Variants are the different forms which can be used in certain environments. So for example, we can have variation in how we say singing and singing. They're both variants of the word singing. Singing, fishing, singing, fishing. Sorry, I said that exactly the same way. Singing versus singing, fishing versus fishing. They possess morphological variants ing versus in, which are variants of the variable ing. And there are usually when we say that something's in variation, of course, there has to be at least two ways of saying it to say that it's variable. And when we study linguistic variation, we also have to take into account this important concept called the principle of accountability. So the principle of accountability basically states that when you're analyzing a specific feature or language use, you have to take into consideration all the possible ways that that language feature can be expressed. Okay, so holds that if it is possible to define a variable as a closed set of variants, all of the variants, including the non-occurrence, must be counted. So all the ways of expressing a variant have to be considered, as well as if the variant isn't even produced at all. So for instance, if the study is about the use of copula, then the following variants or variations would be accounted. So you would take into consideration the present conjugated form. How many times do you say am, is, are, and in what contexts? And you would also take into consideration if there's any invariant B. Invariant B is the B that you see in AAVE. She be telling people she ate. I be in my office, right? So count how many times that happens and doesn't happen and in what context. Zero copula, which is omitting that completely. And if you want to know more examples of different linguistic features that are variable that people have analyzed for atlas purposes, you can look at that link below on the Yale website. And that concludes dialectology.